Let's analyze the sources. And welcome to today's explainer. We're going to tackle a massive, often deeply painful, and, quite frankly, incredibly expensive reality in the corporate world. We're talking about the digital transformation. Look, we all know the drill, right? A company decides it's finally time to modernize. They go out and buy a shiny new enterprise resource planning system, an ERP. They drop millions on the software, the hardware, the external consultants, the whole shebang. But so often, when the switch is finally flipped, absolute chaos ensues. So today, we're not actually going to talk about the code or the servers or the cloud architecture. Instead, we're going to review the human challenges in transitioning to a new system and, more importantly, propose some really concrete solutions to improve team skills. We're zeroing in entirely on the human element, the actual people who have to sit at their desks every day and use the new software.
Okay, let's dive into this. Why do technological upgrades fail? It's literally a question that keeps executives up at night. Now, you might think it's because the software is buggy or the data migration was flawed or maybe the servers crashed. And sure, those things definitely happen, but let's completely shatter the illusion right now that perfect software guarantees a flawless launch. It simply doesn't. You can have the most beautifully coded, perfectly integrated system in the world, and your rollout can still be an unmitigated disaster. Why? Because organizations become so obsessed with the technology itself that they completely forget about the psychology of the people who actually have to operate it.
I want to read you this really powerful quote from an excellent ERP-focused article we're using as a source today. It says, "When things go wrong, the system will be blamed. But the vast majority of problems that go live are user problems." Let that sink in for a second. This is absolutely our central thesis for today. When the new workflow stalls, when the invoices aren't going out on time, when the supply chain data gets completely mangled, human nature dictates that your staff will just point at their screens and say, "The system is broken," right? It's just so much easier to blame the implementation team or the software vendor than to sit there and admit, "I don't actually know what I'm doing." The reality is, the true failure isn't in the code. It's in the human readiness.
To solve this, we need a roadmap. So here's how we'll break it down. First, we'll look at the human challenge of system implementation. Second, we'll introduce the 80KR model for change management. Third, we'll examine real-world knowledge gaps and field resistance. And finally, we'll wrap up with actionable solutions to empower team skills.
Let's start right in with Section 1, the human challenge in system implementation. Just imagine the atmosphere in an office the week before an ERP go-live. The pressure is absolutely immense. And very often, companies make the critical mistake of letting the calendar force their hand, rushing things just to hit a date. To avoid making a catastrophic gamble, the sources outline some strict pre-go-live non-negotiables. First is verified data entry. Every single piece of data must be entered, checked, and verified by the users who actually own it. Second, you absolutely must run a faultless conference room pilot. Basically, this means simulating real-world operations where the software, the hardware, and most importantly, the people perform without a single hitch. Just hoping it'll be all right on the night is not a strategy. But the third point here is perhaps the most vital: unequivocal leadership support. All department heads must visibly and loudly nail their colors to the mast. If senior staff show even a hint of hesitation or doubt, their teams will instantly lose the resolve to push through the inevitable teething problems. If you do not have absolute rock-solid commitment from the top down, you literally must pause the go-live. Because once a launch fails, turning that ship around is a monumental and sometimes downright impossible task.
And speaking of teething problems, Murphy's Law will absolutely kick in. Mistakes are going to happen. The key here is setting expectations. Your staff needs to hear explicitly that things will go wrong, and they need to know exactly what the contingency plans are. But hear me loud and clear on this specific rule from the ERP Focus article. Reverting to the old system is not a contingency plan. In fact, going backward must be explicitly, categorically ruled out. Why? Because if you leave that back door open, the very moment the new ERP gets difficult or frustrating, your staff will lose faith and immediately revert to their familiar old notepads, spreadsheets, and legacy software. You really have to burn the ships.
Moving on to Section 2, the ADKAR model for change management.
So if we can't retreat, how do we make sure our people can actually march forward? To properly manage this challenge, we need a diagnostic framework to measure their psychological and behavioral preparedness. The ADKR model is brilliant for this because it breaks down human adaptation into 5 sequential pillars, and you can't skip a single step. First is awareness. Do your employees actually know why the change is happening? Second is desire. Do they have the willingness to support it? Third is knowledge. Do they have the actual training to understand the new system? Fourth is ability. Can they practically execute what they've learned in the real world? And fifth is reinforcement. What mechanisms are in place to ensure they don't just slide right back into old habits? It's just a fantastic, structured approach to ensure technical change is actually met with human readiness.
Let's transition to Section 3, knowledge gaps and field resistance.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how we can apply the 80-car models to a real-world patient. We're looking at a 2025 master's thesis from the Bandung Institute of Technology, authored by Kafi Al-Furqan. It perfectly illustrates what happens when you measure a real organization against these 5 pillars. The research analyzes a state-owned mining company in Indonesia called PT Bukit Asam, or PTBA. They were undergoing a massive digital transformation, shifting from their old legacy system, which was called Ellipse, to a highly complex SAP ERP system. And let's be clear, this isn't just a simple software update. In a complex hierarchical mining operation, this is a behavioral and structural earthquake. The researcher used the 80-car method to survey and interview employees to find out exactly how ready they really were.
The qualitative interviews in this study revealed this fascinating yet incredibly relatable dynamic, a stark generational divide. On one side, you've got the Gen Z and younger staff. The data showed they were highly eager to learn and adapt to the new SAP system. They naturally embraced the digital shift. But on the other side, you have the veteran staff. These are employees who have spent years, maybe even decades, mastering the legacy Ellipse and Sysya systems. They are totally comfortable. For them, this new ERP isn't an upgrade at all. It's actually a threat to their established competence. This highlights a profound latent resistance that you absolutely cannot fix with an IT manual. It requires deeply targeted, empathetic change management.
The study generated quantitative scores for each of the 8-car pillars. Out of a possible 5, the score for knowledge came in at 3.594. That is the most critical, and the lowest, metric in the entire thesis. Let me explain why this is so alarming. The employees actually had high awareness. They knew the company had to modernize. But when it came to actual knowledge of how the ERP worked, they were deeply lacking. This is the weakest link. This specific gap between knowing a change is coming and knowing how to execute it is exactly where transitions bleed money and productivity just grinds to a complete halt.
So, distilling the research down, here is the core diagnosis of PDBA's field challenges. They had strong top-down awareness, right? The strategic messaging worked, but the execution was heavily flawed. They suffered from a very uneven training rollout. The study noted that only certain key users or communicators were given deep training, while the broader workforce was pretty much left in the dark. Naturally, this led to fragmented technical literacy and deep knowledge silos. For example, the budgeting and accounting division was highly prepared, while other departments were barely exposed to the new tools. And the dangerous reality here is that an integrated ERP system only works if every department knows how to feed it correct data. A siloed success is ultimately an organizational failure.
This brings us to our final section, Section 4, Solutions to Empower Team Skills. So, we have our diagnosis. The tech might be ready, but the humans are unevenly prepared, they're siloed, and in some cases, they're silently resisting. So how do we fix it? Well, the first proposed actionable solution from the research is the creation of a Functional Readiness Task Force, or FRTF. Typically, an ERP rollout is managed almost entirely by the IT project team or top executives. But let's face it, they're way too far removed from the daily grind. The FRTF, on the other hand, is a cross-functional body made up of mid-level leaders and respected peers from within the various departments. They essentially act as change agents. They form this vital bridge between the grand strategic intent of the C-suite and the micro-level, localized execution on the floor. Because they intimately know their specific departments, they can identify hidden resistance, map readiness at a micro-level, and translate all that complex technical jargon into practical daily workflows.
The second solution attacks that knowledge gap directly. It's a targeted ERP communication and readiness campaign. The research stresses that this should be a tightly focused 4 to 6 week initiative. Now listen closely to this. The goal here is not deep technical mastery. You don't just dump complex system simulations on anxious employees. The goal is psychological availability and practical literacy. It's really about demystifying the monster. You do this through highly accessible onboarding. Things like departmental town halls, engaging infographic series, maybe simple pulse surveys. You're just trying to make the staff feel informed and gradually more confident. You have to break down their fear before you ever ask them to process a live transaction.
And that brilliantly sets up the third, and honestly perhaps most powerful solution. Integrate change metrics into leadership KPIs. Remember earlier when we talked about the absolute necessity of unequivocal leadership support? Well, this is exactly how you enforce it. You make department heads and senior managers strictly personally accountable for the human transition. You take metrics like user training completion rates, ERP simulation participation, and readiness survey scores, and you embed them directly into the manager's performance dashboards. When a leader's own quarterly review and their bonuses depend on their team's ability to use the new software, you absolutely guarantee sustained organizational momentum. Change readiness stops being just an IT problem and instantly becomes a leadership responsibility.
So the crucial point is perfectly captured in this final insight derived from the thesis. ERP success must be validated by output and usage, not merely attendance and training sessions. I mean, anyone can sign an attendance sheet at a seminar, right? But can they actually run the report? Can they process the order? Post-go-live measurement is what ultimately secures the reinforcement phase of that AIDCAR model we talked about. If you aren't measuring actual operational output and holding leaders to those KPIs, human nature will inevitably pull your team right back into their old, comfortable habits, and your multi-million-dollar system will just become an incredibly expensive paperweight.
As we've seen today, the code is rarely the true point of failure, it's the people operating it. Transitioning to a new system is fundamentally an exercise in human psychology, generational empathy, and relentless, structured change management. So I'll leave you with this provocative question to reflect on before your organization signs off on its next major software investment. You might have the budget and you might have the tech, but is your team genuinely, fundamentally ready for the next system? Really think about your own internal human readiness. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you on the next one.